In a mansion where affection is a luxury item, a silent employee notices more than words reveal. She realizes the boy of the house will be discarded to seal a billion-dollar deal. In the decisive moment, she takes his hand and bursts into the room she was never allowed to enter. With courage, she interrupts the negotiation and gives voice to the silent cry of a child. And before the world of the powerful, a father discovers that losing his son costs more than any merger. The November sun beat down on the asphalt of Belgravia, an upscale London neighborhood, as Grace Sterling adjusted the navy blue uniform she had worn for 4 years at the Montgomery family's mansion. At 41, her face bore the marks of a life of hard work, but her brown eyes held a rare firmness. Before ringing the doorbell, she took a deep breath. No matter how many times she entered that house of marble and glass, the contrast with her reality in East London always intimidated her for a few seconds. The electronic gate opened with a discreet whir. Inside the property, the immaculate garden displayed rare orchids and a swimming pool that reflected the sky like a turquoise mirror. The mansion, with its contemporary and minimalist lines, looked like a setting from a decorating magazine. It was a world apart in the chaotic metropolis, a world of people who never had to worry about overdue bills or crowded public transport. "Good morning, madam," greeted the security guard, a discreet man who rarely spoke more than necessary. "Good morning, Joshua," Grace replied, walking along the stone driveway to the main entrance. In the kitchen, Grace found Mrs. Eleanor, the 60-year-old cook who had served the family since before the birth of Peter, the only son of the homeowner. "She's already started," Mrs. Eleanor whispered, referring to the lady of the house. "Woke up complaining about the noise the boy made during the night." Grace nodded, understanding. Danielle Montgomery, the second wife of Edward Montgomery, owner of the Montgomery Investment Group, was known for her difficult temperament and impatience with her stepson. The boy, orphaned since he was 4, lived like a ghost in his own home, present but invisible when convenient. "Is little Peter's breakfast ready?" "Yes, but she told me to wait. She said he needs to learn discipline and that waking up too early is spoiled child nonsense." Grace held back a comment. In 4 years of working there, she had learned that words could cost jobs, and she needed that salary to support her ailing mother in Brighton. Still, her heart ached whenever she saw the treatment given to little Peter. "I'll go see how he is," she decided, ascending the marble staircase that led to the second floor. The hallway, decorated with contemporary artworks and indirect lighting, led to a series of identical doors. Grace stopped at the third door on the right and knocked softly. "Little Peter? May I come in?" A muffled murmur answered. She opened the door slowly. The room was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden, but it had something impersonal about it, like a luxury hotel room. There were no drawings on the walls, no scattered toys, no small marks of a childhood lived to the fullest. Everything was organized, with an almost painful precision for a child's room. Peter was sitting on the edge of the king-size bed, swinging his legs that didn't reach the floor. At 8 years old, he was small for his age, with neatly cut brown hair and dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He wore Egyptian cotton pajamas and matching socks, all chosen by Danielle, who insisted he maintain an heir's appearance even for sleep. "Good morning, my prince," Grace smiled, using the nickname only she used. "How was your night?" The boy's eyes lit up when he saw her. It was a discreet but real glow, something rare in that house where genuine smiles were luxuries money couldn't buy. "I had nightmares again." "Gracie," he confessed in a low voice, using the affectionate nickname he had created for her. "I dreamed I was in a very cold place, all alone." Grace sat beside him, gently stroking his fine hair. "It was just a dream, my dear. You're not alone." Peter leaned against her, seeking the human warmth he so desperately lacked. "She's mad at me again." It wasn't necessary to specify who she was. Danielle Montgomery, a 34-year-old former model, had entered Edward's life 2 years after the loss of Louisa, his first wife, a victim of a rare heart condition. The new union, celebrated with a party for 1,000 guests and a celebrity magazine cover, seemed perfect on paper. He, the billionaire widower seeking to rebuild his life. She, the stunning woman who promised to bring joy back to that house. But the reality behind the curtains was very different. "Your stepmother is just tired," Grace lied. as she always did when she needed to protect Peter from the painful truth. Danielle had never wanted to be a mother, especially not to a child who wasn't hers. "Is Daddy coming back today?" Peter asked, changing the subject, but the hope in his voice was palpable. Edward Montgomery, 45, divided his time between the Montgomery Group headquarters in London's financial centre and international trips. To the world, he was one of the most successful businessmen in the UK, commanding an empire that ranged from civil construction to technology. To Peter, he was a distant figure who appeared at hurried dinners and on some weekends, always with his phone at the ready for emergencies. "Yes, your father will be home for dinner," Grace confirmed, "and he told me he has a surprise for you." The boy's face lit up briefly, but the shadow soon returned. "Gracie, do you think he still likes me?" The question hit Grace like a punch. How could an 8-year-old child doubt his own father's love? But she knew the answer. Edward loved his son, she had no doubt about that, but he had allowed work and his new wife to create an abyss between them. "Of course he does, my prince. Your father loves you more than anything in the world." Before Peter could reply, the door opened violently. Danielle Montgomery entered, stunning in an Italian silk ensemble and French designer shoes. Her impeccably straightened blonde hair framed a face that had graced magazine covers, but her cold green eyes contradicted her outward beauty. "Grace, don't you remember the rules? Peter must have breakfast in the dining room, not in his bedroom. And why is he still in his pajamas? Edward is arriving today with important guests." Grace stood up, adopting the posture she had learned to maintain in front of her employer. "Forgive me, madam. We were just about to go downstairs. We have visitors arriving this afternoon. Important people," Danielle emphasized, looking directly at Peter. "I want him to be presentable and, more importantly, discreet. No interrupting adult conversations or making noise." Peter lowered his head, visibly shrinking. "Understood." "Madam," Grace replied, feeling her blood boil, but keeping her voice controlled. Danielle surveyed the room with a critical eye. "And tidy this space. It looks like a child's room." When the door closed, Grace turned to Peter, finding silent tears streaming down his delicate face. Carefully, she wiped them away with her calloused fingers. "Come on, my prince. I'll make those pancakes you love with chocolate syrup." The boy nodded, trying to smile. "Gracie, you'll never leave me, will you?" The question caught Grace off guard. In her profession, she had learned not to form deep bonds, to maintain a professional distance. But with Peter, it had been different from the very first day. When she found him crying, hidden in the linen closet, missing the mother he could barely remember. "I'm here. Little Peter, I'm always here." What Grace didn't know that morning was that her promise would be tested beyond imagination in the coming hours, when a business meeting would forever transform the fate of that family and her own. Danielle Montgomery watched London from the panoramic window of the master suite, speaking softly on the phone. The sky was cloudy, portending a storm, a perfect reflection of the tempest she herself orchestrated behind the scenes of that house. "Everything is on track, Richard. Edward has no idea." She smiled, adjusting the diamond ring she had received on her last wedding anniversary. "The Monteverde Institute in Switzerland has already reserved the spot. We just need him to sign the papers, which will happen after today's meeting." On the other end of the line, Richard Beaumont, the family's attorney and Danielle's private confidant, confirmed the details of the plan they had been devising for months, sending Peter to one of Europe's most exclusive boarding schools. In theory, an exceptional educational opportunity. In practice, the convenient removal of an obstacle. Custody won't be a problem. With the document we've prepared, Edward will retain legal guardianship, but will delegate daily care to the institution, Richard explained. "We'll present it as the best solution to provide stability for the boy during this family transition." Danielle hung up the phone with a satisfied smile. The family transition was her favorite euphemism for what was really at stake. The merger between the Montgomery Group and the Alcott conglomerate, an alliance that would create the largest corporate empire in the UK. A merger that, not by coincidence, included a personal element. The arranged marriage between the Alcott's daughter and Edward Montgomery. Obviously, this required a small detail, the discreet annulment of her own marriage, already negotiated on extremely favorable terms for Danielle. £50 million, an apartment in Paris, and shares in the new company were a small price for Edward to get rid of her without scandals that would harm the merger. The only real obstacle was Peter, or rather, the irrational attachment Edward still maintained for his son. Therefore, the strategy was to gradually distance the child, starting with the boarding school. For his own good would be the justification. Downstairs, oblivious to these machinations, Grace served breakfast to Peter in the spacious breakfast nook. Unlike the formal dining room with its table for 20 and crystal chandeliers, the nook had a more welcoming atmosphere. It was there that the boy actually ate, away from his stepmother's critical eyes. "Another pancake, my prince?" she offered, watching with satisfaction as the boy had already recovered some of his spirits. "Yes, please." Peter smiled, his face smeared with chocolate syrup. "Gracie, do you think Daddy's surprise is a present?" Grace hesitated. Edward had mentioned an important piece of news for his son, but his tone on the phone was more serious than enthusiastic. "Maybe it's a special trip with him," she suggested, opting for optimism. "Your father mentioned that perhaps you could visit that amusement park you want to see so much." In truth, Edward had mentioned nothing of the sort, but seeing Peter's face light up at the possibility was worth the small lie. The kitchen intercom rang, interrupting the moment. It was Joshua, the security guard. "The representatives from the Alcott conglomerate have just arrived. Mrs. Montgomery asked to prepare coffee and water." Grace frowned. Wasn't the meeting scheduled for the afternoon? "Tell him I'm already seeing to it," she replied, before turning to Peter. "My dear, it seems we have to be quicker. Let's finish breakfast and get you ready." While helping Peter with his bath and clothes, Grace couldn't shake a feeling of unease. In recent days, she had noticed strange movements in the house, whispered calls, hastily hidden documents, knowing glances between Danielle and frequent visits from the law firm. "Why do I have to wear these clothes?" Peter complained, uncomfortable in the children's formal suit he rarely wore. "I won't be able to play like this." "It's just for a little while," Grace consoled, adjusting his shirt collar. "Then you can change." On the ground floor, activity was intense. Staff members positioned newly arrived flower arrangements. Crystals were polished, and the climate-controlled wine cellar had been opened for the selection of appropriate wines. Grace descended with Peter by the service staircase, trying to remain discreet as Danielle always demanded. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Eleanor preparing trays of sophisticated canapes. "What's happening?" she asked in a low voice. "Wasn't the meeting later?" The cook shrugged. "They changed everything at the last minute. Mr. Edward arrived early. He's been in the office with Richard Beaumont for almost an hour." Grace's stomach tightened. Richard Beaumont was the lawyer who appeared whenever there was bad news or complicated decisions in the family. "Gracie, I want to see my dad," Peter asked, pulling her hand. "Now isn't a good time, dear. Your father is in a meeting." "But he promised a surprise." Before Grace could reply, Danielle entered the kitchen. She was stunning in a red dress that accentuated her perfect silhouette. Discreet but visibly expensive jewelry complementing the look. "Grace, take Peter to his room and make sure he stays there until further notice." Her tone allowed no argument. "Edward and I will talk to him later, after the meeting." Peter's eyes filled with tears. "But Daddy's here!" "I want to see my daddy." Danielle ignored her stepson, addressing only Grace. "He must not come downstairs under any circumstances. We are finalizing an agreement that will change the future of this family." Grace felt a shiver. There was something in Danielle's expression, an anticipated triumph, that deeply alarmed her. "Yes, madam," she replied mechanically, holding Peter's hand. As they ascended the stairs again, the boy cried silently. "He always promises and never keeps it," he murmured. In the second-floor hallway, Grace made an impulsive decision. Instead of taking Peter directly to his room, she detoured to the gallery overlooking the entrance hall, hiding with him behind an ornamental column. From there they could observe the activity without being seen. An elegant entourage was crossing the hall at that moment. Charles Alcott, the 70-year-old patriarch, known for his coldness in business and for building his empire from scratch. His wife Martha, aristocratic even at 65, and the couple's daughter Helen, a 35-year-old woman, educated in the best European universities and known in business circles for her sharp intelligence and boundless ambition. "Is that them, Gracie?" "The important guests?" Peter whispered. "Yes," Grace replied. observing how Danielle greeted them with exaggerated, almost subservient cordiality. Unusual behavior for someone who treated even her closest friends with a certain arrogance. Edward appeared soon after, impeccable in his custom-made Italian suit. He was thinner and had dark circles under his eyes that his neatly trimmed beard couldn't completely conceal. He greeted Charles with a firm handshake and formally kissed the hands of Martha and Helen, lingering a little longer with the latter. It was then that Grace noticed the way Danielle observed the interaction between her husband and Helen Alcott had something calculating about it, not jealousy. As if she were evaluating merchandise being transferred from her hands to others. "Why are you looking like that?" Peter asked, always perceptive. "It's nothing, dear. Let's go to your room now before they see us." On the way to Peter's room, they passed Edward's half-open office door. On the mahogany desk, Grace glimpsed open folders with documents. Among them, a colorful brochure with what appeared to be a photo of a castle surrounded by snow-capped mountains, the Monteverde Institute. Quickly, she entered the office and grabbed the brochure, hiding it in her uniform pocket before continuing with Peter. In the room, while the boy drew distractedly, Grace examined the material. It was an exclusive boarding school in the Swiss Alps, with astronomical tuition fees and an educational philosophy that promised to transform heirs into leaders. On the back cover, a handwritten note chilled her blood. Enrollment confirmed for Peter Montgomery. Start January 2023, after formalization of the agreement. January was less than 2 months away. And what agreement was this that needed to be formalized? The pieces began to fit together in a disturbing way. The whispered conversations, the arrival of the Alcotts, Danielle's calculating behavior, Edward's tension. "Little Peter," she called softly. "Do you know if your father and Danielle are thinking of sending you to study somewhere else?" The boy looked up from his drawing, a house with 3 figures holding hands that clearly represented a wish, not a reality. "Danielle said I'm going to a place with children like me, where I won't bother anyone." His voice was small, resigned. "She said Daddy agreed it's better that way." Grace sat on the bed, feeling as if the world was collapsing. What could she do? She was just a housekeeper. Confronting Edward or Danielle would at least mean losing her job, perhaps even being sued for invading her employer's privacy. But looking at that boy, at his eyes that already carried so much pain for someone so young, she knew she couldn't simply obey this time. Not when Peter's future was at stake. Downstairs, voices rose in the main living room. The meeting that would decide the fate of everyone in that house was beginning. The main living room of the Montgomery mansion, with its double-height ceiling and strategic lighting, was designed precisely for occasions like this, gatherings where power and money intertwined under the veneer of social cordiality. Works by renowned British artists adorned the walls. An original Turner, Constable canvases, and more sculptures created the perfect atmosphere of sophistication and Britishness that impressed foreign visitors. Edward Montgomery occupied the head of the oval rosewood table, with Charles Alcott to his right, a calculated deference to the patriarch. Danielle sat next to Martha Alcott, leaving Helen strategically positioned to Edward's left. Richard Beaumont, the attorney, remained discreetly in a corner, with a folder of documents ready for the appropriate moment. "The numbers are impressive," Charles commented, after Edward presented the financial projections of the possible merger between the companies. £300 million in synergies in the first year alone. Edward nodded, personally serving a rare whiskey to his guest. It was a business ritual he mastered perfectly, the generous host sharing not only opportunities, but also his collection of exclusive beverages. "And this is just the beginning," he replied. "When we fully integrate our operations in Europe, we can double that value in 3 years. Helen leaned slightly forward, her analytical green eyes fixed on the charts spread across the table. A graduate of Oxford with an MBA from Cambridge, she commanded the international division of the Alcott conglomerate with an iron fist. At 35, she was respected and feared in the financial market for her sharp intelligence and often ruthless decisions. "The issue isn't just operational synergies," she observed, her voice melodious but firm. "It's the message we'll send to the market. 2 business dynasties united form not just a larger conglomerate, but a new tradition." Edward discreetly studied Helen as she spoke. She was undeniably elegant, with black hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated her high cheekbones. Her analytical power was remarkable. In other circumstances, perhaps he would purely admire her as an equal in the business world. Dynasty, Charles repeated, savoring the word as if it were his 30-year-old whiskey. That's exactly what we'll build. A legacy for future generations. Danielle cast an almost imperceptible glance at Richard, who nodded slightly. It was the perfect hook. Speaking of future generations, Martha Alcott interjected, delicately touching Danielle's hand, we heard that your lovely stepson is about to embark on a new educational phase. Edward frowned, confused. Pardon? Danielle hastened to explain, her voice melodious and studied. I was just talking to Martha about the Monteverde Institute. Fantastic educational opportunity for Peter. Monteverde? Edward seemed genuinely surprised. We haven't discussed sending Peter to boarding school. An uncomfortable silence hung over the room. Charles cleared his throat, exchanging glances with his daughter. Perhaps it's best we first discuss the formal terms of the merger, Helen suggested, skillfully deflecting the subject. The family aspects can be addressed later. But the moment of tension had already broken the carefully constructed rhythm. Edward straightened in his chair, suddenly alert. What family aspects are we discussing exactly? On the second floor, Grace remained with Peter in his room, but her heart and mind were in the meeting happening below. The boarding school brochure burned in her pocket, like evidence of betrayal. Looking at the boy, who was now assembling a puzzle with childish concentration, she made a decision that could cost her job, or worse. Little Peter, I need to go downstairs for a moment to get your snack. You stay here quietly, promise? The boy nodded distractedly, absorbed in his task. Grace left, closing the door without locking it, a small act of rebellion against Danielle's explicit instructions. She descended the service staircase and stealthily approached the main living room. Positioning herself behind a column, she could hear the conversation without being seen. Edward, be reasonable. Danielle's voice had that persuasive tone she used when she wanted something. We're talking about Peter's future. The Monteverde Institute has educated generations of business leaders. It's the preparation he needs to one day take his place in what will be the largest business conglomerate in the UK. But he's only 8 years old, Edward countered, and Grace could hear the hesitation in his voice. Louisa always wanted him to grow up here, close to family. Danielle sighed theatrically. Darling, Louisa left us 4 years ago. Circumstances have changed. Peter needs stability, discipline, and a new family configuration requires adjustments, Martha Alcott added softly. When Helen was little, boarding school was fundamental for her development, wasn't it, dear? Helen agreed with a contained smile. It's where I learned to be independent and focused. New family configuration? Edward repeated, and now there was a note of distrust in his voice. What exactly are we talking about? Charles Alcott straightened up, adopting the tone he used to close billion-pound deals. Edward, we are practical men. This merger isn't just about companies, but about legacies. Helen is my only daughter and heir. You have a son who will need guidance. An alliance between our families would solidify the business in ways that contracts cannot guarantee. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Grace covered her mouth with her hand to stifle her suddenly accelerated breathing. Are you suggesting an arranged marriage? Edward's voice was low, controlled, but with a hint of incredulity. I prefer to think of it as a strategic union, Helen corrected, showing no embarrassment. We are adults, Edward. We've both had our marriages out of impulse. She cast a calculated glance at Danielle, who maintained a neutral expression. Now is the time for rational decisions, which benefit not only us but future generations. And what about Danielle? Edward asked, looking directly at his current wife. It was then that Richard Beaumont stepped forward, opening his folder. We've already discussed the terms. An amicable separation agreement is prepared, extremely favorable for Mrs. Montgomery. Danielle smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Darling, we always knew our arrangement had an expiration date. 2 years was a good period, don't you think? And now you need to think about the future of the Montgomery Group. Grace recoiled, shocked by the coldness of the discussion. Marriages, separations, a child's future, all being negotiated as if they were mere contractual clauses. She needed to go back to Peter. Upon reaching the second-floor hallway, however, she found the room empty. "Peter?" she called, panic growing in her chest. "Peter, where are you?" She checked the bathroom, the closet under the bed, places where the boy usually hid when he was upset. Nothing. It was then that she noticed the room's intercom, used to call the staff, was on. The red light indicated that the system was active and transmitting everything said downstairs directly to the room. Peter had heard everything. Guided by an instinct she couldn't explain, Grace ran to the main staircase, the closest to the living room. And there, sitting on the top step, hugging his knees and with silent tears streaming down his face, was Peter. "They're going to send me away," the boy whispered when he saw her. "So I don't bother anyone." Grace sat beside him, hugging his trembling shoulders. "No, my prince. Your father wouldn't let that happen." But even as she spoke the words, she doubted. She had seen Edward give in so many times to Danielle's manipulations in recent years. How much was the word of a father who prioritized business above all else worth? "He said he has a big company to take care of," Peter sobbed. "I heard everything. Danielle is leaving, and he's going to marry the woman with black hair, and I'm going to a school in the snow." At that moment, Grace Sterling, who had always lived by rules, respected hierarchies, and stayed in her place designated by society, made a decision that would forever change the course of several lives. "Come with me," she said, standing up and extending her hand. "Where to?" Peter asked, wiping his tears with his shirt sleeve. "To talk to your father." Grace took a deep breath, feeling a determination she didn't know she possessed. "It's time for him to hear you. It's time for everyone to hear." In the living room, the discussion had evolved to practical terms. Richard detailed the shareholding structure of the new company and the prenuptial agreement between Edward and Helen, while Danielle disguised her triumph behind a mask of dignified resignation. The Alcotts already treated the deal as closed, discussing who would take which positions on the new board of directors. "We could announce the engagement at the same event as the merger," Martha suggested. "A well-orchestrated press release would minimize any negative repercussions from the separation." "And what about Peter?" Edward insisted, who had not yet given his final agreement. "I can't just send him to another country. He's barely gotten over the loss of his mother." Helen intervened, her voice calculatedly gentle. "Edward, I know it's difficult, but think about what's best for the boy. A house in transition, with busy adults managing a complex merger. It wouldn't be a stable environment. The Monteverde Institute will offer the structure and attention he needs during this period." "Exactly," Danielle agreed. "Besides, children adapt quickly. In a few months he'll be happy there, making friends with other children of his social level." Edward seemed hesitant, but the weight of expectations on his shoulders was visible. His entire empire, the legacy he had built, depended on this merger. The market was changing rapidly. Without the Alcott's capital and connections, the Montgomery Group might not survive the next 5 years. "We need your decision, Edward," Charles Alcott pressed, always direct. "My daughter won't wait forever, and we have other interested partners." It was at this critical moment that the living room door opened. Everyone turned, surprised by the interruption, and were confronted with an unexpected scene. Grace Sterling, the domestic worker who should have been invisible backstage, held the hand of little Peter Montgomery, the involuntary heir to all that power struggle. "Forgive the interruption," she said, with a firmness that surprised even herself. "But I think there's someone who needs to be heard in this conversation." The silence that followed the Alcott's departure was broken only by the sound of the armored car leaving the property. Richard remained standing, a hand on his son's shoulder, as if fearing that the boy might disappear if he let go. William looked at his father with a mixture of relief and surprise, still processing what he had just witnessed. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Veronica finally broke the silence, her voice controlled but trembling with contained fury. "You've just destroyed the only chance we had." "No, Veronica," Richard replied with surprising calm. "I've just saved what really matters." Grace remained near the door, aware that she had overstepped all the boundaries of her position, but without regret. In 2 decades working in the homes of London's elite, she had never interfered in family matters, until that moment. Something about the situation of that motherless boy, emotionally abandoned by his father, had touched a deep chord in her being. "Grace," Richard addressed her, Take William to get something to eat. I need to talk to Veronica. Yes, sir. She reached out her hand to the boy, who hesitated. Will everything be okay, Daddy? The childish voice carried the weight of someone who had already known enough of life to fear its twists and turns. Richard knelt, coming to his son's eye level. Everything will be fine. I promise I won't let anyone send you away. However, when the door closed behind Grace and William, Veronica exploded. How could you? How could you throw away everything we worked for? 3 months negotiating with the Alcotts, convincing them that Montgomery Holdings was still worth the investment, and you destroy everything for a fit of belated paternity. Richard sat heavily in his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of all the decisions he had postponed in recent years. Belated paternity, is that how you see my relationship with my son? I see it as reality, Richard. Since we got married, how many times have you really been present for William? How many dinners, how many bedtime stories? She walked to the bar, pouring herself a whiskey. You delegated his upbringing to nannies and governesses while you immersed yourself in work. And now suddenly you're father of the year? The truth in her words hit him like a physical blow. Richard had emotionally distanced himself from his son after Rachel's death, unable to cope with the pain that the boy's face, so much like his mother's, caused him. Perhaps I've been an absent father, he admitted, but that doesn't justify sending my son to another country as if he were a problem to be eliminated. Veronica sat opposite him, adopting a more controlled tone. Boarding school would be an educational opportunity, not an exile, and temporary until we stabilized the situation. The situation you were already planning without consulting me, Richard retorted. A new strategic marriage with Caroline Alcott. Was that the plan from the beginning, Veronica? A cold smile formed on her lips. And you really believed the merger would be purely commercial? The Alcotts don't share control, Richard. They absorb. The only way to ensure you maintained any relevance would be through a family alliance. And where would you fit into this perfect arrangement? Veronica shrugged, the studied indifference of someone who had already calculated all possibilities. I have my own connections. This marriage was always a strategic partnership. We never deluded ourselves about that. The coldness of the statement hit Richard like cold water. Indeed, his marriage to Veronica, 2 years after Rachel's death, had been more pragmatic than passionate. She had brought stability, political connections, and a restored public image to the Montgomery family. He had offered status, financial comfort, and the traditional surname she so valued. And William? Where would he fit into your strategies? Let's be realistic, Richard. William is your son, not mine. My responsibility was to ensure his material well-being, not to replace the mother he lost. She finished her drink in a single gulp. What happened today was a mistake we may not be able to correct. Without the Alcotts, Montgomery Holdings won't survive the next quarter. I'll find another way, Richard stated, with a conviction he didn't fully feel. What way? We've explored all alternatives. Veronica raised her voice. The banks won't extend more credit. Investors are pulling back. 3 projects are stalled. You really traded an empire for a hug. The question hung in the air like an accusation. For a moment, Richard felt the weight of responsibility suffocate him. Not just for William, but for the 5,000 employees who depended on the company, for the suppliers, for the clients who had entrusted their savings to properties not yet delivered. Perhaps it was impulsive, he finally conceded, but I cannot sacrifice my son. Nobody asked for a sacrifice, Veronica exploded. We're talking about a boarding school, not a... She hesitated, searching for the word. Perpetual exile. Thousands of children from families like ours study abroad. Thousands of children didn't lose their mother at 4 and don't have an absent father, Richard countered. William has already lost too much. I won't impose another loss. Veronica stared at him for a long time, as if evaluating a depreciated asset. Then perhaps I need to reconsider my position in this family. The veiled threat did not go unnoticed. What do you mean? I mean, Richard, that I married a leader, not a man who throws everything away for sentimentalism. If you're determined to sink with the ship because of a boy, perhaps I need to look for a lifeboat. The words hung between them like a toxic cloud. Richard felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. Perhaps the marriage had already been doomed long before that afternoon. Do what you think is best, Veronica. She stood up, adjusting her impeccable suit. I'm going to the apartment in Mayfair. When you regain your senses, call me. We can still try to save something from this situation. The door closed behind her with a soft click, as controlled as everything about Veronica Drummond Montgomery. Richard remained motionless for long minutes, the silence of the office allowing his thoughts to reorganize. In a few hours, he had rejected the only viable financial solution for his company and possibly ended his marriage. The feeling, surprisingly, was not one of despair, but of a strange clarity. In the kitchen, Grace served a snack to William, trying to maintain normality despite the tension that permeated the house. The boy, more perceptive than adults usually gave him credit for, ate silently. "Aunt Gracie, what's going to happen now?" he finally asked, pushing away the half-eaten sandwich. Grace sat beside him, carefully choosing her words. "I don't know exactly, my prince, but your father made a very important decision today. He chose you. But will the company go bankrupt? Will we be poor?" The question revealed the weight of adult conversations the boy had absorbed in recent weeks. Children in mansions like that often carried anxieties they didn't fully understand. "Your father is a very intelligent and capable man," Grace replied honestly. "He will find a way, even if it's difficult." The sound of footsteps interrupted the conversation. Richard entered the kitchen, a part of the house he rarely frequented, with a tired but determined expression. William, he called his son, sitting at the simple breakfast nook table, a contrast to the luxurious office he had just left. "We need to talk." Grace made a move to withdraw, but Richard stopped her with a gesture. "Stay, please. You've earned the right to be part of this conversation." Surprised by the unusual recognition, Grace nodded, remaining by William's side. "Son, I want you to know that you're not going to any boarding school abroad. Not now, not later, unless one day you yourself want to." Richard spoke, looking directly into the boy's eyes. "And I want to apologize for not having been present as I should have been." "Will the company go bankrupt because of me?" William asked, guilt evident in his childish voice. "No, son. The company faces difficulties that began long before this meeting. And if it goes bankrupt," Richard hesitated, as if the possibility was still difficult to verbalize. "If it goes bankrupt, we'll build another one. Together." The smile that spread across William's face lit up the kitchen like no imported chandelier ever could. "Really together? Like, you and me?" "You and me," Richard confirmed, for the first time in years feeling that he was doing the right thing. "From today on, every night when you come home from school, I'll be here. I promise." Grace watched the scene with a heart full of emotion. That moment of reconnection between father and son, so simple and so profound, justified the risk she had taken by interrupting the meeting. "And Veronica?" William asked hesitantly. "Veronica?" Richard chose his words carefully. "She's thinking about some things. She went to the apartment for a few days." The relief on the child's face was evident, though he tried to hide it. "I see. Now," Richard took a deep breath, "I need to make some calls. We have a company to save. But afterward, how about we watch that dinosaur movie you like so much?" "You never have time for movies," William commented. The natural distrust of someone accustomed to broken promises. "From today on—" "I do," Richard assured, affectionately ruffling his son's hair. "Grace, can I speak with you privately?" In the hallway, out of William's earshot, Richard looked at the employee with a new perspective. For 4 years, that discreet woman had been more than an employee. She had been his son's main emotional link, the constant presence he should have been. "I want to thank you for what you did today," he began, uncomfortable with the unusual vulnerability. "It was inappropriate, against all the rules, and exactly what we needed." Grace maintained her respectful posture, but without the subservience that normally characterized her interaction with her employer. "I apologize for the manner, sir, but not for the act itself." "I'm not apologizing," Richard clarified. "I'm thanking you. You saved my son. And perhaps you saved me too." The sincere recognition hit Grace unexpectedly. In 2 decades serving wealthy families, her humanity was rarely fully acknowledged. "If I may be so bold, sir," she ventured, "William is an extraordinary boy. He didn't need privileges or expensive boarding schools. He just needed to be seen by his father." The simplicity of the truth struck Richard deeply. "And you saw that before me. Sometimes those who serve have a perspective that those who are served cannot see," Grace replied with the wisdom of someone who had observed the dramas of grand houses for years. Grace, Richard hesitated, formulating a new thought. How would you feel if I asked you to take a more active role in William's life? Not just as a governess, but as a kind of tutor. Someone who helps him grow while I reorganize the company. It would be an honor, sir, Grace replied without hesitation, emotion barely contained in her normally controlled voice. But only if I can do it as a partner, not just as an employee. William needs boundaries, structure, and most importantly, truth. Partner, Richard repeated the word, testing its unusual flavor. That's fair. And as for your salary, I'm not negotiating financial terms, sir, Grace interrupted him with serene dignity. I'm talking about trust and respect. Richard nodded, suddenly aware of the social chasm that would normally separate him from this woman. A chasm she had crossed that afternoon out of pure love for his son. Trust and respect, he agreed, extending his hand to her as he would to an equal. It's a deal, Grace. The handshake sealed more than a new domestic arrangement. It established an improbable alliance between the London businessman and the Manchester governess, united by the well-being of a child they both loved in different ways. In the days that followed, the Montgomery mansion underwent subtle but significant transformations. Veronica did not return, sending only her lawyer to retrieve personal belongings and discreetly initiate separation proceedings. The staff whispered in the corridors, but Grace kept the team focused and disciplined. Richard reorganized his schedule, ensuring he was home every afternoon when William returned from school. In the first few weeks, the boy was suspicious, expecting the routine to break at any moment. Gradually, as he perceived his father's consistency, he began to flourish. His drawings gained livelier colors, his appetite improved, his sleep became more peaceful. At the company, the situation remained critical. Without the merger with the Alcotts, Montgomery Holdings faced the scenario Veronica had predicted: scarce credit, retreating investors, stalled projects. Richard worked tirelessly mornings and evenings, exploring alternatives he would have previously considered unthinkable, selling non-essential assets, renegotiating with suppliers, redesigning projects to reduce costs without compromising quality. One evening, almost a month after the fateful meeting, Richard found Grace in the library arranging books William had left scattered after their nightly reading session. "How's he doing?" he asked, helping her organize the children's volumes. "Better every day," Grace replied with her characteristic discreet smile. "Today he talked about his mother without crying." "That's progress." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of the mention of Rachel. Do you think she would approve of my recent decisions?" The question surprised Grace with the vulnerability it revealed. The powerful businessman rarely showed uncertainty. "I believe so, sir. The Mrs. Rachel I knew for a few months was, above all, a dedicated mother. She would value your choice for your son." The silence that followed was comfortable, one of those that only settles between people who have developed mutual respect. "By the way," Richard commented, changing the subject, "I managed to get a new investor for the Islington project. Smaller than the Alcotts, of course, but with much more reasonable terms." "That's excellent," Grace replied, genuinely happy. In the preceding weeks, she had become an involuntary confidant of Richard's business concerns, listening to him as he thought aloud during late dinners. "It was thanks to your suggestion, actually," Richard confessed. "That idea of investing in sustainable projects for the middle class. The new investor was impressed with the proposal." Grace blushed slightly. Her suggestions had only been comments based on conversations she heard from her nieces in Manchester. Young families dreaming of functional, eco-efficient and affordable apartments. "I'm glad it was useful," she replied simply. "You've been much more than useful." "Grace," Richard observed her with a new perspective. "You've been essential. For William, for the house, and in some way even for the business." The sincerity of the compliment created a moment of unexpected tension between them. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Grace looked away, suddenly aware of the diminished social distance that had previously separated them so comfortably. "It's late," she commented, rearranging the already tidy books. "You must be tired." "Richard," he gently corrected. "When we're alone, I prefer you to call me by my name." The request, simple yet loaded with implications, hung between them like a bridge being built over an abyss. Grace nodded slightly before withdrawing. leaving Richard alone with thoughts he dared not yet fully formulate. 6 months had passed since the fateful afternoon when Richard Montgomery chose his son over what seemed to be the only salvation for his company. The London autumn painted the Belgravia mansion's garden with golden and reddish hues, creating a dramatic contrast with the perennial green of the tropical trees. The house had changed. Not just in decoration, more welcoming and less ostentatious after Veronica's departure, but mainly in the energy that permeated it. Children's laughter echoed through the previously silent corridors. Doors once kept closed to preserve expensive furniture now remained open, allowing William to run freely between rooms. In the kitchen, the nerve center of this new home, Grace supervised breakfast while William finished his homework at the solid wood table. "Aunt Gracie, do you think my dad will like my science project?" The boy held up a model of the solar system made with colorful styrofoam balls. "He'll love it," Grace replied with genuine conviction, "especially since you did it yourself without help." The boy's smile lit up his face, now fuller and healthier than months ago. William had flourished under the new family dynamic, a present albeit busy father, and Grace as a constant and affectionate maternal figure. Richard entered the kitchen adjusting his tie, a folder of documents under his arm. At 45, he carried new lines of expression, silent witnesses to months of struggle to save his company. But there was also a serenity in his gaze that hadn't existed before, the peace of someone who had finally aligned his priorities. "Good morning." "Champ," he greeted his son, affectionately ruffling his hair. "Is this the project for the science fair?" "Yes. I painted Jupiter last night. Look at the stripes," William explained animatedly, pointing to the details of his work. "It's incredible," Richard praised sincerely, pouring himself coffee. "Grace, remember that meeting with the Japanese investors today? At 2 in the afternoon, she confirmed, placing toast on the table. "I've already set out your navy blue suit and the burgundy tie they gave you as a gift on their last visit." "It shows respect for their culture," Richard smiled, as always impressed by the shrewdness of the woman who, officially, was still just the house's governess, but in practice had become much more counselor, partner in William's upbringing, and increasingly, a personal confidant. "What would we do without you?" The question escaped more sincerely than intended, creating one of those moments of subtle tension that had become more frequent between them. Grace blushed slightly, looking away at the toast she was arranging. "You'd find someone more competent, probably," she replied with that humility Richard had learned to recognize not as subservience, but as a quiet strength. "I doubt it very much," he countered, holding her gaze when she finally looked up. William watched the interaction with interest, his childish intuition picking up nuances that even the adults didn't fully perceive. "Aunt Gracie isn't just competent," the boy declared with the blunt simplicity of children. "She's family." The declaration hung in the air, laden with truth and unexplored possibilities. Richard nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those simple words. "Yes, she is," he agreed, his voice softer than usual. Grace blinked quickly, containing the emotion that this recognition provoked. In recent months, the line between employee and family had become increasingly thin, but this was the first time someone had verbalized the transformation. "Time for school." "My prince," she announced, breaking the moment of vulnerability. "The driver should be waiting." After William left, Richard remained in the kitchen, idly leafing through some documents while Grace organized the breakfast dishes. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the clinking of plates and the rustling of papers. "How are the negotiations with the Singapore fund going?" Grace finally asked, drying her hands on her apron. Richard smiled, still surprised by her genuine interest and understanding of his business. Over the months, the late-night conversations in the library had become a ritual, he sharing business challenges, she offering surprisingly lucid perspectives from someone who observed the world from a completely different angle than his own. Promising. They particularly liked the sustainable housing project for Shoreditch. Richard closed the folder. "Your idea of including community gardens on the rooftop was the differentiator. I just repeated what my niece Joanne commented about the condominium she'd like to live in." Grace downplayed the credit as she always did. "You underestimate your contribution." "Grace," Richard observed her seriously, In recent months, your casual observations have helped me completely reposition the company. We're building what people actually want, not what we think they should want. Grace met his gaze for a moment before looking away, uncomfortable with the direct compliment. By the way, Richard continued, the divorce with Veronica was finalized yesterday. The news, though expected, created a wave of almost palpable tension in the kitchen. The separation process had been surprisingly civilized. Veronica, pragmatic as ever, had accepted reasonable terms in exchange for absolute discretion. The final chapter of a marriage that had never truly been an emotional union was closed. I hope it was. Fair to both, Grace commented diplomatically. It was, Richard confirmed. Veronica is in Europe, apparently involved with a Swiss banker. Life goes on. The lack of bitterness in his voice was genuine. The end of the marriage was less a loss, and more the natural conclusion of an arrangement that no longer served either party. And what about you, Richard? How do you feel? Grace asked, genuine concern in her voice. He considered the question for a moment, analyzing his own feelings with an honesty that had become characteristic of his new phase. Relieved, a little apprehensive about the future, but mostly at peace, Grace nodded, understanding. Over the past 6 months, she had witnessed Richard's transformation. From an obsessive businessman who sacrificed personal relationships for professional success to a more balanced man who valued his son above all else and rediscovered the meaning of building something with purpose beyond profit. And what about you, Grace? Richard asked unexpectedly. It's been a while since you visited your family in Manchester. The question caught her off guard. In all her years working in wealthy families' homes, employers rarely showed interest in her personal life. I'm fine, she replied automatically. Maybe I'll visit at the end of the year. Why not sooner? We could arrange a temporary substitute, Richard insisted, surprising her again with his consideration. You've barely taken any time off in recent months. I don't feel comfortable leaving you and William now. The answer came out spontaneously, revealing more than she intended. I mean, the house is still adjusting to so many changes and you've become indispensable, Richard completed, his soft tone contradicting the formality of the words. Grace didn't answer immediately, aware of the delicate ground they were treading. The past few months had created an intimacy between them that transcended the employer-employee relationship, but remained undefined, unspoken. No one is indispensable, she finally replied, the practical wisdom of her 41 years manifesting itself. But I appreciate knowing my work is valued. Richard watched her for a long moment, as if considering saying something more. Instead, he checked his watch and stood up. I need to go. I have that meeting in Canary Wharf before the Japanese. Good luck, Grace wished sincerely. When he left, she remained in the kitchen, allowing herself a rare moment of personal reflection. In 4 years at the Montgomery house, she had gone from a mere employee to a central piece in the family's machinery. The affection she felt for William had long transcended professional boundaries. She loved that boy, as if he were her own son. And as for Richard, Grace shook her head, pushing away dangerous thoughts. A Manchester housekeeper and one of London's most traditional businessmen? The mere idea would be comical if it weren't so risky. There were social boundaries that should not be crossed, no matter how much the modern world pretended they no longer existed. In the weeks that followed, the Montgomery mansion gradually prepared for Christmas. For the first time in years, Richard decided they would celebrate the holiday with an intimate party, only for close friends and some long-standing company employees. I want it to be something welcoming, not ostentatious, he explained to Grace as they discussed the preparations in the library. Something William will truly appreciate. He'll be delighted, Grace replied, jotting down ideas. I can prepare some Northern English recipes in addition to the traditional menu. Yorkshire puddings, Lancashire hot pot, Eccles cakes. Perfect, Richard enthusiastically approved. And Grace, I want you to participate as a guest, not as an employee. She looked up from her notes, surprised. What do you mean? I want you to sit at the table with us. You're part of this family now, as William said. The seriousness in his tone left no doubt about his sincerity. Grace felt her heart race. The invitation was more than a gesture of consideration. It was a public declaration of her new status in the house. I don't know if that would be appropriate. Appropriate according to whom? Richard gently challenged. The same social conventions that would have had me send my son to boarding school to save a company? The comparison made her smile. You're right. But still nothing. It's decided. Richard smiled in that way that had become more frequent in recent months, warm, genuine, without the weight of the worries he had previously carried constantly. In the week before Christmas, the house transformed. Grace personally supervised the decoration, opting for elements that reflected the family's new identity. Less ostentation, more coziness. A natural pine tree in the entrance hall was decorated with handmade ornaments William had made at school, mixed with Murano crystal pieces Richard had insisted on keeping. Christmas Eve arrived with a fine drizzle typical of the London winter. Guests began to arrive around 8, a select group of people Richard truly valued, not just strategic contacts like at the parties organized by Veronica. Grace supervised the final details of the supper when Richard found her in the kitchen. He had swapped the traditional suit for a light shirt and well-cut trousers, elegant but comfortably informal. "Still not ready?" he asked, noticing she was still in uniform. Grace hesitated. "I'm rethinking this idea of sitting at the table with the guests." "Why?" Richard approached, concerned about her sudden insecurity. "Your social circle, Richard, they're people from another world. Executives, lawyers, architects. What would I, a woman from rural Manchester, with an incomplete secondary education, do in that conversation?" The vulnerability in her confession surprised Richard. Grace had always shown such strength and certainty in her convictions that it was easy to forget the social barriers she faced daily. "Grace," he spoke softly, "those people are here because I admire their character, not their diplomas or bank accounts, and none of them have shown half the wisdom, dignity, or courage that you show every day." The intensity of his words left her momentarily speechless. "Besides," Richard continued, a smile playing on his lips, "there's an 8-year-old boy out there asking every 5 minutes when his Aunt Gracie is joining the party. Are you really going to disappoint him on Christmas?" The argument was irrefutable. "That's a low blow," Grace replied, finally smiling. "Give me 30 minutes to get ready." 20, Richard negotiated, checking his watch. "Supper will be served at 9. In her simple room at the back of the house, which Richard had insisted on renovating and expanding months ago, Grace faced her reflection in the mirror. At 41, her face bore the marks of a life of work and determination. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was a dignity in her features that amply compensated for the absence of youth or sophistication. The dress she had chosen was simple but elegant, dark blue, straight cut, without unnecessary adornments. A gift she had sent to her sister in Manchester, but which her sister had returned, claiming it was too formal for her rural life. On her feet, low-heeled shoes bought especially for the occasion. When she finally emerged into the dining room, William's reaction was instantaneous. "Aunt Gracie," the boy exclaimed, running to hug her. "You look beautiful." The guests' gazes turned to her, some with polite curiosity, others with thinly veiled surprise. Grace felt her face burn, but maintained the upright posture her mother had taught her since childhood. Head held high isn't arrogance, it's dignity. Richard approached, a sparkle of admiration in his eyes. "William is right," he commented softly. "You look stunning." The warmth in her cheeks intensified, no longer from discomfort, but from an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel for a long time. At 41, Grace Sterling, the Montgomery Mansion's governess, felt truly seen, not as an employee, not as a maternal figure for William, but as a woman. The supper proceeded in an atmosphere of genuine cordiality. To Grace's surprise, she found more in common with the guests than she expected. The architect responsible for Montgomery Holdings' new projects had grown up in Brighton and shared memories of northern foods and festivities. The company's lawyer, a stern-looking man, revealed himself to be a passionate reader of classic literature after a few glasses of wine. At the center of the table, William shone as never before, excitedly recounting his school projects, interspersing stories with praise for the food prepared by Grace. Richard, seated at the head, observed the interaction with an expression of contentment that few would associate with the once austere businessman. "A toast," he announced when dessert was served, raising his glass. To the family we choose, not just the one we are born into. The guests raised their glasses, but Richard's eyes met Grace's at the other end of the table. The silent moment of connection spoke more than any formal declaration could express. Later, when the guests had departed and William was fast asleep after the excitement of the night, Richard found Grace on the back veranda. She was watching the moonlit garden, still wearing her party dress. "Can't sleep?" he asked, joining her on the wooden bench. "Eventful night," she replied with a smile. "I think I'm still processing it. You did wonderfully. Marcia, the architect, wouldn't stop praising your knowledge of interior design." Grace chuckled softly. "House decorating is different from interior design, but I appreciate her kindness." They remained silent for a few minutes, enjoying the tranquility of the night and each other's proximity. It was one of those perfect moments that seem to exist outside of time, when social barriers, conventions, different personal histories momentarily lose meaning. "Grace," Richard broke the silence, his voice deeper than usual, "I need to tell you something." She turned to face him, noticing the seriousness in his expression. "What is it? Any problems with the company?" "No, it's not about work." He hesitated, suddenly insecure, a rarity for the man accustomed to making decisions involving millions without blinking. "It's about us." The word hung between them, loaded with possibilities and risks. "Us?" Grace repeated, her heart racing against her will. "I know it sounds crazy." "It probably is." Richard ran his hand through the graying hair at his temples, a gesture Grace recognized as a sign of nervousness. "But in recent months, you've become as essential, for William, for this house, and for me." "Richard," she began, unsure how to respond. "I'm not just talking about gratitude," he continued, determined to express what he had been holding back for weeks. "I'm talking about respect, admiration, and something more that I don't quite know how to name yet." Grace felt the world spin slightly. In her boldest dreams, she had never imagined this conversation. "There's a distance between us that goes beyond the personal, Richard. Different worlds, different stories. And yet here we are." He took her hands, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "When I look ahead to the future, it's you I see by my side. Raising William, sharing dinner, discussing projects in the library. Not as an employee, not as a friend, but as a partner," Grace suggested, her voice almost a whisper. "A partner," Richard agreed, the term inadequate, but the closest they could get in that moment of shared vulnerability. "I'm not proposing anything formal now. It would be premature, but I want you to know that my feelings for you have long transcended the appropriate boundaries between employer and employee." Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the confession and its implications. What would people say? The Montgomery heir and the Manchester housekeeper. The same people who expected me to sacrifice my son for a business merger. Richard gently countered, "I no longer care about their opinions." She smiled, recognizing the profound change in his perspective. The man she had known years ago would have considered such a social scandal unthinkable. "William, adore you. Probably already see us as a family more than we do ourselves." The last argument hit her hard. For months she had watched the boy draw family figures, a man, a woman, and a child holding hands. Were they what he represented in his hopeful drawings? "I don't expect an answer now," Richard added, gently releasing her hands. "I just wanted you to know how I feel before the new year begins." Grace nodded, grateful for the absence of pressure. "Thank you for your honesty. I need time to process this." "All the time you need," he smiled, standing up from the bench. "Merry Christmas, Grace." "Merry Christmas, Richard." As she watched him walk back into the house, Grace allowed herself a rare moment of reverie. The girl who had left Manchester at 17, with 2 changes of clothes in a market bag and the address of a cousin in London, would never have imagined being on that veranda, on that night, with those possibilities before her. Life had its own plans, apparently. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to allow herself to dream beyond the limits the world had set for her. The new year brought transformations to the Montgomery mansion that even the most optimistic oracle would not have predicted. With the turn of the calendar, Richard implemented changes not only in his company, but in the entire structure of his personal life. The first and most significant was the change in Grace's status in the house. One January morning, He gathered the staff in the main living room, territory traditionally reserved for employers, and announced that Grace Sterling would be promoted to official house administrator, with authority over all domestic decisions and direct participation in William's upbringing. "It's not just a professional change," he explained to a group of surprised but not entirely shocked faces. "It's the recognition of a role she has informally played for months." Josephine, now the head cook, exchanged knowing glances with Silas the gardener. The staff had observed the evolution of the relationship between the employer and Grace with the characteristic shrewdness of those who, by being frequently ignored, end up witnessing more than employers imagine. "Mrs. Sterling will have her own office on the ground floor and will be treated with the same respect you would show me," Richard concluded, closing the matter in a way that allowed no questioning. For Grace, the promotion represented more than a professional change. It was a cautious step towards something they still couldn't fully name. After Richard's confession on Christmas Eve, they had both entered a kind of careful dance, acknowledging their feelings, but moving forward with the prudence of those who know the risks of a hasty move. At the company, Richard faced even greater challenges. Although he had secured new investors, Montgomery Holdings operated on a delicate balance. The medium-sized housing projects, inspired by conversations with Grace about the real needs of working families, were beginning to gain recognition, but still didn't generate the financial return necessary to completely stabilize the company. It was on a rainy February afternoon that the confrontation they both secretly feared finally happened. Richard returned early from a meeting, drenched by the tropical storm lashing London. He found Grace in the library, organizing children's books while William did his homework. "How was the meeting with the Chinese?" Grace asked, immediately noticing his tense expression. "Postponed." Richard loosened his tie, collapsing into a leather armchair. "But I ran into someone unexpected in the hotel lobby." Something in his tone made Grace stop what she was doing. "Who?" "Augustus Alcott." The name hung in the air like an omen. "Apparently the Chinese are negotiating with him too. Is that a problem?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. "Potentially." Richard sighed deeply. "The Alcotts have the resources to offer terms I can't match. If they secure the Chinese investment, they'll definitively consolidate their position as market leaders. And Montgomery Holdings? It will survive, but on a reduced scale. We'd have to sell some strategic land, focus exclusively on medium-sized projects." He paused, weighing his next words. "Augustus mentioned that the proposal is still on the table." "What proposal?" Grace asked, though she already suspected. "The merger. On the same terms as before." Richard avoided her gaze. "Including the personal terms." The implication was clear. Caroline Alcott was still available, and the strategic marriage was still part of the package. The business alliance that would save the Montgomery Empire, at the cost of personal sacrifices. "I see." Grace kept her voice controlled, though she felt her heart racing. "And what did you reply?" "That I needed to think." Richard finally looked up to meet her eyes. "It would be hypocritical if I said I hadn't considered it even for a moment." The honesty hurt, but Grace preferred it to comforting half-truths. In her life, she had learned that facing reality, no matter how hard, was always the most dignified path. "It's an important decision," she replied with careful neutrality. "It affects not only you, but hundreds of employees and their families." "And us," Richard added softly. "It affects what we've started to build here." Grace nodded, unable to fully articulate what she felt. In recent months, she had allowed herself to dream of possibilities she had always considered out of reach. A true family, a man who valued her not just as an employee, but as a companion. "Would you consider it?" The question escaped before she could contain it. "Consider what?" "The marriage to Caroline. The boarding school for William. Rebuilding your life according to the original plan." Richard stood up, approaching her with slow steps. "I considered it for exactly 3 seconds. The time it took to remember you entering that meeting room, hand in hand with my son, reminding me what truly matters." Grace felt the lump in her throat loosen slightly. "But the company will survive. Smaller perhaps, but more aligned with values that truly matter." He held her hands, a gesture that still seemed bold, even after months of growing closeness. I won't repeat past mistakes, Grace. I won't sacrifice true relationships for strategic mergers. The moment was interrupted by William, who ran into the library, waving a paper. I finished my homework. Can I play in the garden now? Richard looked out the window, where the torrential rain continued. I don't think so today, champ. How about a game of chess? I prefer video games, the boy negotiated, already running towards the game room. When they were alone again, Grace resumed the conversation. Have you decided what you're going to tell Alcott? Yes, Richard held her gaze firmly. I'm going to decline as I did last time. But now for even stronger reasons. The implication of his words hung between them, unsaid but clearly understood. Something was growing there, something that transcended the professional arrangement, gratitude, or even friendship. Something neither of them yet dared to fully name. Spring arrived in London, softening the city's contours with bursts of colourful cherry blossoms and milder afternoons. At the Montgomery mansion, the season brought not only natural renewal, but also a new phase for its inhabitants. William, now almost 9, flourished academically and socially. The shy and anxious boy had given way to a confident child who brought friends home to play and spoke openly about his feelings. The therapy started months earlier had helped him process the loss of his biological mother and accept the changes in his family. On a particularly pleasant afternoon, while Grace supervised a meal the staff was preparing in the garden, she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Sterling? The elegant and controlled voice froze her in place. May we talk? Veronica Drummond stood near the ornamental fountain, impeccable in a light linen suit, as if she had never left that house. Thinner and more tanned than before, but with the same calculating look Grace knew so well. Mrs. Drummond, Grace replied, maintaining her composure. I didn't know you were returning to the UK. I arrived yesterday. Veronica approached, assessing the changes in the garden with clinical interest. Is Richard here? At the company. He should return in a few hours. Grace hesitated, uncertain about the protocol. Would you like to wait? I can ask them to prepare some tea. It won't be necessary. Veronica smiled, a gesture that didn't reach her eyes. Actually, it's you I want to speak with. Grace felt a tightening in her stomach. In the months after Veronica's departure, she had occasionally imagined this encounter, but never under such informal circumstances in the territory she now considered partially her own. Of course. We can sit there. She indicated a set of chairs under a leafy jabuticaba tree. Sitting face to face, the two women represented worlds that rarely met on equal terms. Veronica, heir to her own fortune, educated in the best European institutions, accustomed to opening doors with her surname. Grace, daughter of farmers from rural Manchester, educated in the school of life, accustomed to entering through the service doors of London mansions. I heard that your position in the house evolved, Veronica began, her tone revealing more curiosity than hostility. Richard gave me more responsibilities. Yes, Grace replied cautiously. Responsibilities, Veronica repeated the word with a half-smile. Interesting choice of terms. Grace remained silent, waiting for Richard's ex-wife to reveal the true purpose of that visit. You know, Grace, I never underestimated you. Veronica crossed her legs elegantly. I always noticed your intelligence, your keen observation, your loyalty. Admirable qualities. Thank you, Grace replied, suspicious of the unexpected compliment. What surprised me was your boldness that afternoon, Veronica continued, clearly referring to the day of the meeting with the Alcotts. I thought I knew your limits. Clearly I was wrong. I did what I believed was right for William. Is that what you tell yourself? Veronica tilted her head, her gaze penetrating. Or was there also a personal interest involved? The insinuation was clear and Grace felt her face burn. My only interest was the boy's well-being. At first, perhaps, Veronica conceded. But now, let's be frank, Grace, you've crossed the line between dedicated employee and something more. The question is, do you really understand what you're getting into? The condescending tone ignited a flame of indignation in Grace, but she maintained her composure. If you came here to intimidate me, Mrs. Drummond, you're wasting your time. Intimidate. Veronica laughed softly. No, Grace, I came here to understand, and perhaps surprisingly to warn you. Warn me about what? About the world you're entering. Veronica leaned slightly. Richard's social circle. The expectations, the unwritten rules. It's a universe that can be merciless to outsiders. I think you underestimate my ability to adapt, Grace replied with dignity. I don't underestimate anything about you. Grace, it's precisely because I recognize your intelligence that I'm here. Veronica paused strategically. Do you know why our marriage truly ended? The question caught Grace off guard. It's not my place to speculate about that. It ended because we were both realists. We married out of mutual convenience, and when the convenience ceased to exist, we went our separate ways. No drama, no romantic illusions. Veronica adjusted a gold bracelet on her wrist. But you and Richard are building something based on emotions. And emotions are volatile, Grace. Why would that concern you? Grace questioned, increasingly intrigued by the real reason for the visit. It doesn't concern me personally. I'm living my life very satisfactorily. Veronica smiled briefly. But I've known Richard long enough to understand his pattern. He's experiencing a moment of rediscovery, of rebellion against the expectations that guided him his whole life. It's refreshing for him, I imagine, this new arrangement with someone so different from his usual circle. Are you suggesting it's just a phase? The calm in Grace's voice masked the pang of insecurity Veronica's words provoked. I'm suggesting that Richard Montgomery is the son of 6 generations of traditional London businessmen. He grew up in exclusive clubs, studied in the best schools, breathes a rarefied air you can barely imagine. Veronica made a calculated pause. How long until the novelty wears off? Until he realizes the social and cultural abyss that separates you? Grace felt the words hit precisely the insecurities she had tried to ignore in recent months. I think you underestimate what we've built here. Perhaps, Veronica shrugged with studied elegance, or perhaps you are overestimating the ability of a man like Richard to truly break with his own world. Before Grace could reply, they heard William's animated voice coming from the side entrance of the garden. Aunt Gracie, look what we made at school today. The boy ran towards them, but stopped abruptly when he recognized the visitor. Aunt Veronica? The term aunt sounded strange, considering that for 2 years she had been legally his stepmother. Veronica smiled, a gesture more genuine than those directed at Grace. Hello, William. How you've grown. The boy approached cautiously, experience having taught him to distrust adults' false cordiality. Are you back to live here? No, dear. Just a quick visit. Veronica studied him with genuine interest. You look well. I'm great. The boy confirmed enthusiastically. Daddy and Aunt Gracie are taking me to Disney for the July holidays. The information seemed to surprise Veronica, who cast a questioning glance at Grace. The trip was a recent plan, a decision made during a relaxed dinner. When Richard had suggested it was time to give William a positive international experience, to replace the memory of the near boarding school. How wonderful, Veronica replied automatically. I'm sure it will be fun. William, quickly losing interest in his ex-stepmother, turned his attention back to Grace. Can I show Aunt Gracie my project now? Of course, my prince. I'll see it in the kitchen in 5 minutes, all right? Satisfied, the boy ran back into the house, leaving the 2 women alone again. He's different, Veronica commented, a slight tone of surprise in her voice. More alive. Children flourish when they receive adequate love and attention, Grace replied, allowing herself a hint of veiled criticism. Veronica caught the implicit message and nodded slightly, acknowledging the hit. Well, I won't take up any more of your time. She stood up, adjusting her impeccable dress. I only came because I felt I should offer a perspective you might not be considering. Why? Grace also stood up, facing the other woman directly. Why would you care about what happens between Richard and me? Veronica held her gaze for a long moment before replying. Let's say I've learned some lessons about the value of genuine relationships. Not all strategic mergers bring happiness, Grace. An enigmatic smile touched her lips. And perhaps I'm curious to see if you two will achieve what Richard and I never really tried. With these disconcerting words, Veronica bid farewell and walked towards the side gate, where a driver waited in a luxurious car. Grace remained under the jabuticaba tree, processing the unexpected encounter and the doubts it had sown. That night, after William fell asleep, Grace found Richard in the library. He had returned late from a series of meetings, looking tired but satisfied. "We managed to close the deal with the Chinese," he announced as soon as he saw her enter. "Smaller investment than the Alcotts proposed, but on much more favorable terms for us." "That's wonderful," Grace replied sincerely. Despite the concerns she had carried since the afternoon, Richard noticed her thoughtful expression. Did something happen? Grace hesitated, unsure whether she should mention Veronica's visit. She didn't want to create unnecessary tension, but she also valued the honesty they had cultivated between them in recent months. "Veronica was here today," she finally revealed. The surprise on Richard's face was genuine. "Veronica, why?" "To talk. With me, specifically." Richard frowned, sitting on the edge of the desk. "About?" "About us, basically." Grace sat in the nearby armchair, maintaining a respectful distance. "About the social abyss that separates us, and how eventually that will become a problem." Richard's expression hardened. Typical of her. She never could accept that other people might make choices different from what she would consider rational. "Perhaps," Grace conceded, but some of her observations were disturbing. "Like what?" Richard asked, genuinely interested in understanding what bothered her. "She said you're going through a rebellious phase against your traditional world. That eventually you'll realize how culturally incompatible we are." Grace avoided his gaze as she exposed her insecurities. "And part of me fears she might be right." Richard approached, kneeling in front of her so they could be at the same level, a symbolic gesture that did not go unnoticed by Grace. "Do you know what I learned in the last year?" His voice was soft but laden with conviction. "That true incompatibilities are not in different origins, but in different values. Veronica and I were from the same world, as she says, but we never shared what truly matters." "And we do share?" Grace asked, allowing herself vulnerability. "Honesty, loyalty, courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. Genuine love for William. A vision of life beyond status and power," Richard enumerated, holding her hands. "It's these values that build a true partnership, Grace, not surnames or bank accounts." The sincerity in his words partially calmed the doubts planted by Veronica, but did not eliminate them completely. "The world out there won't be so understanding, Richard. People will talk, judge." "Let them talk," he smiled with a quiet confidence he had only recently developed. "Do you know who taught me not to care about others' expectations? You in that meeting room, when you decided that a child's happiness was worth more than social conventions?" Grace felt her eyes well up, moved by the reference to the moment that had transformed their lives. "Still, I fear your family, your friends, those who truly matter have already accepted what's happening here. William adores you. My sister in London is eager to meet you in person during the December holidays." Richard gently squeezed her hands. "And as for the others, well, whoever can't respect my choice doesn't deserve a place in our lives." The use of the pronoun our did not go unnoticed. It was a commitment, a declaration of union that transcended temporary arrangements or conveniences. "I know we are still treading carefully," Richard continued, "respecting your time, building something solid. But I want you to know that I have no doubts, Grace, about us, about what I feel, about what I want for our future." Grace's heart raced at the almost declaration. In recent months, they had shared moments of growing intimacy. Deep conversations, casual touches that became more frequent, glances that conveyed more than words. But they still maintained a respectful caution, aware of the delicate ground they were navigating. "I also have no doubts about what I feel," she finally admitted, allowing herself to express what she had kept for months. "I just fear the world will conspire against us." Richard smiled, a determined glint in his eye. "Then we'll face the world together, as we have until now." That night, under the silent testimony of the books that filled the library walls, Richard Montgomery and Grace Sterling sealed their commitment with a kiss, the first of many to come. A kiss that represented not only the meeting of two hearts, but the fusion of worlds that prejudice and conventions insisted on keeping separate. "I believe there are things money can't buy, and origins that don't determine character," Richard whispered against her lips. "And you taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it." Grace smiled, finally feeling at home, not in the luxurious mansion, but in the arms of the man who chose to see beyond appearances and conventions. "And you taught me that families aren't born ready. she replied softly. They are built day after day with love and respect. As the night progressed over London, in the Belgravia mansion, a new family consolidated, not by blood ties or social contracts, but by conscious and courageous choices that defied expectations and redefined the meaning of belonging. We didn't do this to prove anything to anyone, he gently corrected. We did it because it was right, because we saw beyond conventions and recognized the value in each other. Richard nodded, pulling her into an embrace. The best investment I ever made wasn't in land or stocks. It was betting on us when everyone said it was madness. And the bravest thing I did wasn't walking into that meeting room, Grace added, but allowing myself to believe I deserved to be here. Together, they looked out the window at the garden they had transformed, just as they had transformed their lives, the company, and William's future. A space where improbable species coexisted harmoniously, creating something more beautiful and resilient than the original design could ever conceive. It wasn't a fairy tale, but something far more valuable, a real story of courageous choices, of barriers broken down, of love that transcended conventions. A story that began when a housekeeper decided that a child's voice deserved to be heard, even if it meant risking everything she had built. 10 years later, the gardens of the Montgomery mansion flourished with a beauty that no European landscaper could plan, wild in some corners, organized in others but undeniably British in its essence, a perfect metaphor for the family that now inhabited it. Improbable, resilient, authentic. Our own garden of salvation, Richard murmured, embracing the woman who had transformed his definition of value, success, and family. Where everyone has a voice, Grace completed, and no one is told to be silent. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Grace, Richard, and William has touched your hearts. This garden of transformations we've witnessed shows us that true courage lies in making authentic choices, even when the world tries to tell us otherwise. To continue this journey of emotions, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about people who defied expectations and found their true place in the world. Find it here by clicking on the link to the left. If this narrative about family, courage, and belonging resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Daily, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of British life in its multiple facets. And don't forget to share in the comments, what was the moment that moved you the most in this journey through the Gardens of Salvation? We look forward to reading your impressions.